there, friends, and welcome back to Fairy Tales in Exile. It has been a while since I last made one of these videos, but I didn't want to let the entire project just fall by the wayside, so I am picking it back up again with our third story, The Yogi's Gift, from the Lilac Fairy book by Andrew Lang. Before I started reading this story, I wanted to give anyone who might be watching a brief background on the context behind the creation of Andrew Lang's fairy books. Because I noticed that this next story was collected from India, I got an inkling that it might not be told in the most sensitive way, and let me get into why that is. Andrew Lang was a Scottish author, poet, reasonably famous guy who was most well known for his collections and, most importantly, editing of these fairy books. Now, he was not the one who actually went out into the field and had conversations with people to collect these stories themselves, but he and his wife worked to translate and edit already collected stories. Importantly, these were collected and edited for a British English-speaking audience. And this story that I'm going to read for you, The Yogi's Gift, was collected by Major Campbell from the area of Firozpur in India. Now, I don't know how familiar any of you all are with British history, but this book was published in 1910, and at that time, and for many decades prior, India was a British colony. While the 19th century saw a huge upsurge in romanticism and the collection of folk tales from the peasantry in some attempt to preserve this old-fashioned country way of life that was being destroyed by the Industrial Revolution, that same approach, when taken in colonized countries by the colonizers, in collecting these pieces of folklore and these traditions and these stories, they were not collected for the benefit of the colonized people, but for almost the viewing pleasure and the entertainment of the society of the colonizers. All of that said, please take the story that I'm about to read with a grain of salt in its portrayal of the people of India. I hope that with this context, you'll be a little bit more prepared for whatever it is you're about to hear. And without any further ado, we will begin reading The Yogi's Punishment. Once upon a time there came to the ancient city of Rahmatabad a yogi of holy appearance, who took up his abode under a tree outside the city, where he would sit for days at a time, fasting from food and drink, motionless except for the fingers that turned restlessly his string of beads. There is a small footnote here that says a yogi is a Hindu holy man. The fame of such holiness as this soon spread, and daily the citizens would flock to see him, eager to get his blessing, to watch his devotions, or to hear his teaching, if he were in the mood to speak. Very soon the Raja himself heard of the yogi, and began regularly to visit him, to seek his counsel, and to ask his prayers that a son might be vouchsafed to him. Days passed by, and at last the Raja became so possessed with the thought of the holy man that he determined, if possible, to get him all to himself. So he built in the neighborhood a little shrine, with a room or two added to it, and a small courtyard closely walled up, and, when all was ready, besought the yogi to occupy it, and to receive no other visitors except himself, and his queen, and such pupils as the yogi might choose, who would hand down his teaching. To this the yogi consented, and thus he lived for some time upon the king's bounty, whilst the fame of his godliness grew day by day. Side note, I have recently been reading about ornamental hermits. I can leave the link to the Wikipedia article in the description, but they are absolutely the wackiest bit of historical eccentricity that I have heard of in recent times, so I beseech you all to go learn about them. This yogi sequestered in the king's garden reminds me very much of an ornamental hermit, so that's where that connects in. Now, although the Raja of Rahmatabad had no son, he possessed a daughter, who, as she grew up, became the most beautiful creature that eye ever rested upon. Her father had long before betrothed her to the son of the neighboring Raja of Dilaram, but as yet she had not been married to him, and lived the quiet life proper to a maiden of her beauty and position. Because, obviously, beauty is the easiest indicator of virtue. There's never been a good-looking person who was bad, or an ugly person with a single redeeming feature, ever in the history of humankind. The princess had, of course, heard of the holy man, and of his miracles and his fastings, and she was filled with curiosity to see and to speak to him. But this was difficult, since she was not allowed to go out except into the palace grounds, and then was always closely guarded. However, at length she found an opportunity and made her way one evening alone to the hermit's shrine. Unhappily, the hermit was not really as holy as he seemed, for no sooner did he see the princess than he fell in love with her wonderful beauty, and began to plot in his heart how he could win her for his wife. Didn't see that coming. But the maiden was not only beautiful, she was also shrewd, and as soon as she read in the glance of the yogi the love that filled his soul, she sprang to her feet, and gathering her veil about her, ran from the palace as fast as she could. The yogi tried to follow, but he was no match for her, so, beside himself with rage at finding that he could not overtake her, he flung at her a lance which wounded her in the leg. The brave princess stooped for a second to pluck the lance out of the wound, and then ran on until she found herself safe at home again. There she bathed and bound up the wound secretly, and told no one how naughty she had been, for she knew that her father would punish her severely. I don't know what to make of this so far. I wish I knew more about how this story was originally told, because so far I'm getting some serious potential colonialist overtones that I can discuss further in my conclusion if they continue to appear. Next day, when the king went to visit the yogi, the holy man would neither speak to nor look at him. "What is the matter?" asked the king. "Won't you speak to me today?" "I have nothing to say that you would care to hear," answered the yogi. "Why?" said the king. "Surely you know that I value all that you say, whatever it may be." But still, the yogi sat with his face turned away, and the more the king pressed him, the more silent and mysterious he became. At last, after much persuasion, he said, "Let me tell you, then, that there is in this city a creature which, if you do not put an end to it, will kill every single person in the palace." The king, who was easily frightened, grew pale. "What?" he gasped. "What is this dreadful thing? How am I to know it, and to catch it? Only counsel me and help me, and I will do all that you advise." "Ah," replied the yogi, "it is indeed dreadful. It is in the shape of a beautiful girl, but really, it is an evil spirit. Last evening it came to visit me, and when I looked upon it, its beauty faded into hideousness. Its teeth became horrible fangs, its eyes glared like coals of fire, great claws sprang from its slender fingers, and were I not what I am, it might have consumed me." I'm sensing just a touch of misogyny here. The king could hardly speak from alarm, but at last he said, How am I to distinguish this awful thing when I see it?" "Search," the yogi said, "for a lovely girl with a lance wound in her leg, and when she is found, secure her safely and come and tell me, and I will advise you what to do next." Away hurried the king, and soon set all his soldiers scouring the country for a girl with a lance wound in her leg. For 2 days the search went on, and then it was somehow discovered that the only person with a lance wound in the leg was the princess herself. The king, greatly agitated, went off to tell the yogi and to assure him that there must be some mistake. But of course, the yogi was prepared for this, and had his answer ready. "She is not really your daughter, who was stolen away at birth, but an evil spirit that has taken her form," he said solemnly. "You can do what you like, but if you don't take my advice, she will kill you all." And so solemn he appeared, and so unshaken in his confidence, that the king's wisdom was blinded, and he declared that he would do whatever the yogi advised, and believe whatever he said. So the yogi directed him to send him secretly 2 carpenters, and when they arrived, he set them to make a great chest, so cunningly jointed and put together that neither air nor water could penetrate it. There and then the chest was made, and when it was ready, the Yogi bade the king to bring the princess by night. And they too thrust the poor little maiden into the chest and fastened it down with long nails, and between them carried it to the river and pushed it out into the stream. As soon as the Yogi got back from this deed, he called 2 of his pupils and pretended that it had been revealed to him that there should be found floating on the river a chest with something of great price within it, and he bade them go and watch for it at such a place far down the stream. And when the chest came slowly along, bobbing and turning in the tide, they were to seize it and secretly and swiftly bring it to him, for he was now determined to put the princess to death himself. The pupils set off at once, wondering at the strangeness of their errand, and still more at the holiness of the Yogi, to whom such secrets were revealed. He's a con man! It happened that as the next morning was dawning, the gallant young prince of Dilaram was hunting by the banks of the river, with such a great following of viziers, attendants, and huntsmen, and as he rode he saw floating on the river a large chest, which came slowly along, bobbing and turning in the tide. Raising himself in his saddle, he gave an order, and 6 men plunged into the water and drew the chest out onto the river bank, where everyone crowded around to see what it could contain. The prince was certainly not the least curious among them, but he was a cautious young man, and as he prepared to open the chest himself, he bade all but a few stand back, and these few to draw their swords, so as to be prepared in case the chest should hold some evil beast or djinn or giant. When all were ready and expectant, the prince, with his dagger, forced open the lid and flung it back, and there lay, living and breathing, the most lovely maiden he had ever seen in his life. Although she was half stifled from her confinement in the chest, the princess speedily revived, and when she was able to sit up, the prince began to question her as to who she was, and how she came to be shut up in the chest and set afloat upon the water. And she said, blushing and trembling to find herself in the presence of so many strangers, because she's been isolated all her life, and that's not a good way to develop social skills in someone who will eventually help rule your kingdom. And she, blushing and trembling to find herself in the presence of so many strangers, told him that she was the princess of Ahmadabad, and that she had been put into the chest by her own father. When he, on his part, told her that he was the Prince of Dilaram, the astonishment of the young people was unbounded to find that they, who had been betrothed without ever having seen one another, should have actually met for the first time in such strange circumstances. In fact, the prince was so moved by her beauty and modest ways that he called up his viziers and demanded to be married at once to this lovely lady who had so completely won his heart. And married they were, then and there, upon the river bank, and went home to the prince's palace, where, when the story was told, they were welcomed by the old Raja, the prince's father, and the remainder of the day was given over to feasting and rejoicing. But when the banquet was over, the bride told her husband that now, on the threshold of their married life, she had more to relate of her adventures than he had given her the opportunity to tell as yet, and then, without hiding anything, she informed him of all that had happened to her from the time she had stolen out to visit the wicked Yogi. In the morning, the prince called his chief vizier and ordered him to shut up in the chest in which the princess had been found a great monkey that lived chained up in the palace, and to take the chest back to the river and set it afloat once more and watch what became of it. So, the monkey was caught and put into the chest, and some of the prince's servants took it down to the river and pushed it off into the water. Then they followed secretly a long way off to see what became of it. Meanwhile, the Yogi's 2 pupils watched and watched for the chest until they were nearly tired of watching, and were beginning to wonder whether the Yogi was right after all, when, on the 2nd day, they spied the great chest coming, floating on the river, slowly bobbing and turning in the tide, and instantly a great joy and exultation seized them, for they thought that here indeed was further proof of the wonderful wisdom of their master. With some difficulty, they secured the chest and carried it back as swiftly and secretly as possible to the Yogi's house. As soon as they brought in the chest, the Yogi, who had been getting very cross and impatient, told them to put it down and to go outside whilst he opened the magic chest. And even if you hear cries and sounds, however alarming, you must on no account enter, said the Yogi, walking over to a closet where lay the silken cord that was to strangle the princess. And the 2 peoples did as they were told, and went outside and shut close all the doors. Presently, they heard a great outcry within, and the yogi's voice crying aloud for help. But they dared not enter, for had they not been told that whatever the noise, they must not come in? So they sat outside, waiting and wondering, and at last all grew still and quiet, and remained so for such a long time that they determined to enter and see if all was well. No sooner had they opened the door leading into the courtyard than they were nearly upset by a huge monkey that came leaping straight to the doorway and escaped past them into the open fields. Then they stepped into the room, and there they saw the yogi's body lying torn to pieces on the threshold of his dwelling. Very soon the story spread, as stories will, and reached the ears of the princess and her husband. And when she knew that the enemy was dead, she made her peace with her father. The end. Here are my thoughts. I didn't do a great job of explaining this while filming, but my takeaway is that this tale can be interpreted from two angles. The first would be looking at it from the perspective of a turn-of-the-century British audience. With a violent, lecherous Hindu holy man who attacks a sheltered young woman from a wealthy household and betrays the trust of her father, this story could be seen as a warning to English readers about the dangers of India. The Raja and his daughter would represent English colonizers and their families, while the tale itself, as edited and presented to English audiences, plays into sensationalist, exoticized narratives and fears about potential threats presented by forays into foreign lands. The second interpretation looks at the tale as it would have been told in India. From this perspective, it's a story teaching young women about the importance of maintaining social norms, in this case about staying inside, in their place, and about the dangers present to those who stray. Marsha Lieberman talks about female acculturation through fairy tales in her work, so I've included a link to a really cool article on JSTOR below in case you'd like to read more on the subject. Overall, I found it an interesting story, certainly for the insight that it gives, both into possibly the norms of 19th, early 20th century India, and also to the sensibilities of the British culture that it was edited for. Every story is the result of so many social and cultural forces, and even if that story is not in line with the moral, social, political standards of today, it is still usually full of evidence about what those standards were in the time when the story was written, or in the case of folktales, collected and edited, and about all of the competing forces that shape something that goes into print in a book like this. All that said, our next tale is going to be The Heart of a Monkey, which it would seem is a Swahili tale, so I guess we get to have a good time analyzing how African stories are presented for the British turn-of-the-century audience. Until then, I hope you stay safe and healthy until it is time for another episode of Fairy Tales in Exile. Bye!